thank you very much for coming. This is the 11th Oxford Rural Farming Conference. Hardly seems possible. I didn't think of it. It was thought up by Graham Harvey, who may or may not be here. My wife Ruth has done all the work since, not all of it, but the lion's share ever since I turn up. But here we are. I just want to introduce what I think the conference is about, what it was actually, the principles on which it was founded, and which I think have to continue into the future. And the first thing to say about the Oxford Rural Farming Conference is that it is and it must be radical. And radical doesn't mean wildly sort of anarchic, doesn't mean Bolshevik, certainly doesn't mean terrorist. As it's construed to be, it does mean getting down to the roots of things, asking what really matters and how we can really achieve what really matters. And we'll have to talk about not only about farming itself, obviously, but also about the economics and the politics and the legal underpinning and the scientific underpinning, and most of all, perhaps the moral and the metaphysical underpinning. What actually are we trying to achieve? What is it good to do? And then the reason it's radical, well, it's radical because we get down to the roots, because we also have to question the status quo. And then not only to question the status quo, but to ask, what do we need to do instead? As things stand, the status quo is dominated by, on the one hand, the neoliberal economy, and on the other by a kind of uncritical technophilia, a belief that technology will solve all our problems. And this philosophy, if you can call it that, is actually wrecking the world. We all know that. The industrial agriculture that emerges from this is a major contributor to global warming and mass extinction and to political human misery and political unrest. Whenever you see a really big problem in the world, you will find agriculture right at the heart of it. Yet, I have been told many times since we began this conference that to try and change it in the radical ways that are needed is unrealistic. But then I ask, if the status quo is wrecking the world, how could it be realistic to try to stick to it? And how could it be more realistic to try to support the status quo than it is to try and rescue what's left of the world and put it back on a proper footing? And the suggestion is, and it's obviously the case, that we can't change from what we have to what we need just by tweaking, just by sort of little ad hoc reforms. We have to begin again from first principles. I think the first principle actually is to simply point out that agriculture, we should build our entire lives, politics, economics, the whole thing, around food and agriculture. They're the things we absolutely have to get right, and they are at the heart of all human activity and all the world's activity. It's not just another service industry, and still less, as an expression I've often heard over the years, still less is it just a business like any other. It's got to be radically different from what we have now. And the thing is that governments are what you might call the powers that be, the oligarchy. Governments, corporates, big financiers, they're wedded to the status quo. They're not going to change it. So if we're going to change it in the way we need to, it has to be a people's movement, or a people-stroke-farmers movement working in combination. And I think groups like XR and Greta Thunberg's movement and so on are indicative of the kind of things we need to do. The task, therefore, is really threefold. The first is to frame the necessary theory, because one of the things that's been missing is a coherent philosophy which says why we're trying to do the things we are and what really needs to be done. And we are now establishing the College for Real Farming and Food Culture, which explores the ideas in depth, but it's here that the ideas can first be raised. The second thing we do, or we need to do, is to demonstrate that there really is an alternative to the status quo, based not on money, but on morality, what are we trying to do that's good, and on ecology. And of course, you lot, you good farmers, are showing that this can be done. The third thing is to ask what we really need instead, in other words, to make the coherent philosophy. What kind of infrastructure do we really need? Ask questions like, is the neoliberalism, the neoliberal approach to the economy, is it really fit for purpose? And instead of just saying, how do we sort of get the corporates on side, we should be asking, do we really need the corporates? What do they actually add to the field of food and farming that couldn't be done by other means, more easily, more cheaply, more equitably? Do they actually add, or do they merely expropriate what's already there? What kind of science do we really need? If you looked at what the government have thought over the last 10 or so years, what the kind of science they promote and advocate is basically sort of biotechnology. Whereas the science we should be developing, which is actually much more subtle, much more difficult, is that of ecology. And what kind of mindset do we need? Well, at the moment we have an ultra-competitive economy, ultra-competitive politics, whereas actually we need to be cooperative. We have a morality, if you can call it that, based on getting ahead, but what we really need is a morality based on compassion and spirituality. This strange word, like agriculture itself, is regarded as a kind of add-on if it's regarded at all. And yet it needs to be at the core of our motivation. It's what lies behind morality. Anyway, and the last thing we should do, which is possibly the most important thing we do, is to bring together people who are showing that things can be different. You're all doing things that are out of the mainstream and yet are the kind of things we need. And perhaps the most important thing of all, been said to me often, is that, okay, you get lots of good ideas from this conference, which is terrific, but the main thing, if you're out there trying to practice agroecology in a basically hostile world, is to demonstrate to yourself that you're not actually on your own. And the point about this conference, I think the real point, 1,000 people will be here, and another 600 trying to get in. The point about this is that it demonstrates that there really is a very, very big movement of very well-informed people who are moving in a quite different direction and are moving in the kind of directions we really need. So as I say, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the drummers. Thank you very much for coming.
I want to build on what my esteemed colleague said about getting to the root by telling you a story. This story comes from the Haudenosaunee people, otherwise known as the Iroquois or Six Nations, who are the indigenous people of the lands where I farm. And the story goes that about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, were starving. It was February, which is the hungry moon, and in their baskets there were small bits of dried venison and small bits of dried blueberry, but really nothing much. And it seemed quite impossible to make it to the time of the ramps in April. And Sky Woman, who's a deity who is part of the creation of the world of humans, was looking down from her heavenly abode at the hungry people and decided to take action. She went down to earth, clothing herself as a beggar, and knocked at the entry to the Longhouse and said, "I'm hungry, will you feed me?" The people of the Longhouse, kind of heart, gathered up the very last of their venison and their blueberries from the basket and made a stew and served it to her, knowing that that meant that their little bit of insurance was offered up and away. After she ate and was satisfied, she revealed herself to be a deity, to be Sky Woman, and she said, "Your heart is good, your mind is good, and so I'm going to gift you my 3 children so that you will never be hungry again. My 3 children are corn, beans, and squash. The corn, the first sister, grows tall and provides a niacin and carbohydrate-rich meal. The second sister, which is bean, fortifies the soil with nitrogen and winds up around the tall sister and provides protein. And the youngest sister, squash, spreads wide and shades out the weeds and provides a vitamin and fat-rich fruit." And so the people planted the 3 sisters' gardens for millennia. But there was a condition, right? Because the 3 sisters were freely given, in turn, they must also be freely given. So when the British and the Dutch came to the shores, they were given maize. They were given squash, they were given beans. That's why we have these foods all around the world as staple crops. They were given. And you look at maize in particular and what it's become on the global stage. It was ripped away from its sisters and has grown as a monoculture. It is turned into biofuels and turned into corn syrup, which is pumped into the veins of our children, driving a diabetes crisis. It is laden with pesticides and fertilizers, creating dead zones and gulfs around the world, the decline of pollinators. It is genetically modified into Terminator seed, into BT, poison. And my belief is that fundamentally, when we talk about getting at the root of real farming, we need to ask ourselves, how do we literally and metaphorically return maize to her rightful place with her sisters into a polyculture? How do we honor the free gift of maize? By ensuring that the heirloom seeds remain viable and that maize is used as intended to nourish the people without damaging the earth? And how do we also honor the humans, the indigenous people and other marginalized communities who provided us with that sacred seed and with the gift of our own lives and our own sustenance? And I look forward to today and ongoing relationships of discussing really what it means to re-indigenize and decolonize our relationship with maize and by extension with farming. Thank you.
In his recent talk at the LEAP conference, Dr. Taro Takahashi from Rothamsted noticed the media-driven pressure to move to a plant-based diet, if not a wholly plant diet, and asked, what would happen to the world's soil if no livestock stepped back on it forever? And having spent 5 decades working in rural Africa and Asia, I'd like to try and consider the question through their eyes rather than through our Western eyes. In 2003, Adam Neiman showed all the world's water as a sphere. That's the large blue blob. The smaller blue blob is the water, the fresh water, and the blob you can't see is the fresh water that we can actually access. At the last Groundswell conference, Simon Jeffrey of Harper Adams did the same for the world's topsoil to 20 centimetres. He put it in a sphere. There it is. That's the world's topsoil in a sphere 25 kilometres across above groundswell. If we spread that across the globe, 2/3 of it is covered with pasture, which co-evolved with ruminant animals and form much of the world's soil, the world's single largest solar panel and terrestrial store of carbon, here in Mongolia and in East Africa, here in South America and in Romania. Now let me take you to India, where I've spent 6 years working home to 1/3 of the world's large ruminants raised on pasture and crop byproducts. 75 million dairy farmers in India produce nearly 20% of the world's milk, collected through 60,000 dairy cooperatives, where every litre of milk that is not consumed within the household can generate income. 5 kilograms of dung produces enough biogas to cook a meal for a large family, and the spent manure, still retaining its nutrient value, is returned to the land to feed the soil. Pasture, ruminants, milk, manure, biogas, food, employment, income, a fully integrated system. Are we in the carbon-intensive West suggesting that these carbon-light rural people give up their way of life? We cannot continue a system where market forces require farmers to distort nature. Rather, we must respond to what nature can provide. When we cultivate the soil to produce the plants that the market increasingly demands, we expose it, release carbon and moisture, and damage the fungi and bacteria living in it. Soil is washed away. As is evident from this data from Northwick, Rothamsted, the green line at the bottom is the soil lost under pasture, and the brown is the soil lost under arable farming. Since time immemorial, farmers have used grazed pasture to heal the soil and rebuild its structure, fungal pathways and fertility. And ideally, the soil should always be covered. As you can see on this 200-acre organic farm of permanent pasture in the south of France, where there is not a plough in sight, tall heritage wheat is planted directly into the pasture using compost tea, with just a herd of red Sussex to manage the pasture and to allow the wheat to compete, producing and selling bread made on the farm. And it's happening also in the UK. John Letts and others are also doing this. Pastoral farmers feel devalued by the simplistic media messages that fail to distinguish between industrial and pastoral farming. Farming can be a lonely business, and as Star Wars fans will know, the Empire wins by making us feel alone. But pastoral farmers are clearly not alone. There are many tens of thousands across the globe. Some of you are in this room. And we thank you for caring for the land, for nurturing your animals, for building soil under pasture, and for farming in conversation with nature. May the force be with you.
My name is Alice Cunningham, representing Shumei International. Following what Leah and John said, I think it's a perfect opportunity for me to talk about the harmony with nature. In Japan, taiko drumming that you just heard is traditionally offered as a prayer for harmony. Taiko is often based on the natural elements such as wind, water, rain, thunder. It is intricately connected to the seasons. It is a call to the spirits of nature. Shumei considers taiko as a spiritual practice that connects us to nature and to surroundings through the beauty and power of the drums. It is like listening to the heartbeat of the earth and reflects a harmony that exists in all living beings and Mother Earth. In the past, people realized that we depended on the nature for our lives, but this sacredness was lost. People used to revere nature, but we have lost the connections. Today, many of us lack the basic understanding where the food comes from or how our actions can improve or impact the surroundings or environment. We're dealing with so many issues like people already mentioned: biodiversity loss, climate change, poverty, disease. But I think we're seeing that many of these problems stem from the lack of, and then also being out of, harmony with nature. There's a delicate balance which has been severely disrupted. Each element in nature has a role. Everything is interconnected. To harm one is to harm others. We need a holistic approach. When we are in harmony with nature, it changes the way we perceive the natural world and relate to life. It cultivates the genuine feelings of gratitude. Instead of seeing food as a commodity, we will see it as a blessing from the nature. Farmers who respect nature will understand, listen, and observe, and it does not interfere with the natural growing process. It trusts the innate power of the soil and seed and recognizes the value of diversity and work in sync with it. We need to build a diversity mindset rather than the monoculture, which goes against nature. Some of the companies has pushed this engineered seeds to the point that some of the native seed varieties have been completely wiped out. It is not natural. We lost the meaning of natural, balanced, and we also lost ethical values. A shift in consciousness is needed to renew our relationship with the earth. One of the ways is through the appreciation of beauty, which can come in many forms. A beautiful landscape or farm, a soothing sound of water, maybe gentle human behaviors, even a simple, beautiful smile. When we experience beauty through any of our 5 senses, we're more likely to be harmonious with ourselves and surroundings. Nurturing our spiritual value, appreciating the beauty, and cultivating the deep respect for nature can provide us the mindset that needed to resolve the challenges that we face. I like to end with a quote from our founder, Mokichi Okada. Nature can teach us everything. Let's learn from nature. I hope this concept can enrich our experiences during this conference and beyond. Thank you very much.
Hello, beautiful people. all of you. Every year I come back here and I see this movement growing and becoming more powerful. And every year I see us moving into more detail and more ecosystem developing, and we're actually developing something so powerful. And something this year has fundamentally changed and shifted in where we've been operating as a movement and what we've been doing. And it's very tangible, and it's also very scary. I think over the last year, every news report I hear, every time I hear my children speaking, I have 4 beautiful daughters who are all very powerful climate activists and working with all the other young people around them, thinking about their future. Every time I hear them speaking, every time I see them at their climate marches and their strikes on Fridays and doing all these things and talking to the other students at school, and I see all those rundowns of photos of kids around the world like speaking up, saying we actually really want a future, it's very powerfully affected how I've felt about our movement and our ability to actually provide the solutions so that they actually have a future. And it's really affecting me. And maybe it's affecting all of us. It's affecting our young people, where I'm actually losing quite a lot of sleep at night, where you just think, how can we sort this out? We're under a great deal of pressure to actually have a living planet for our children. You know, this is a big deal, that we have to have a living planet for our future generations to carry on this wonderful life that we've got around us. And, you know, it was interesting over Christmas. I was working with my daughter, who's now, you know, she grew up with me on the farm, and we lived in a low-impact fossil fuel community in Somerset together, and they grew up on the land there with me and with other members of our community, trying to earn a living from the land, growing what we needed without fossil fuels. And then, you know, have gone on to progress, to have careers and a life ahead of them, and planning to have their own children. And over Christmas, a man who was in the community where they grew up, who was 76 years old, had been living there for 26 years, helping bring on the next generation of people who knew how to live on the land without fossil fuels, how to live in a community, to build your own housing, to provide your own food, how to plow with a horse, how to turn the hay, how to grow the vegetables and the carrots that we needed, you know, how to preserve our apples and to make the apple juice and the cider and the things that we needed to have our daily livelihoods. You know, he died in the bender that he lived in, and my children and I were really thinking about that and the way that they are thinking about trying to have a viable livelihood for themselves and the future. And I wanted to pay tribute to Mike and to our ancestors and all of the people who have given our generation some knowledge and skills to get ourselves out of this mess, and to be able to keep passing on that knowledge so future generations will still have those minds that can think about these things and work these things out, so that there are strands of survival out there that we can draw from our ancestral knowledge and from the knowledge and the work of all of us in the projects that we have. If I think about that community we're in, we were a bunch of hippies going to the land to try and create something, because they were, you know, former road protesters and academics and you know, greenies who didn't have any idea how to start making hay and to grow our own vegetables and to save seeds and to make our, you know, our things. But we learned those because we drew from the knowledge of the people who did remember those things, and we learned them, and those people have gone on to start their own farms, and we went on to start our own farm, and now we're talking to politicians, and we're saying, look, there's an ecological crisis facing all of us where we may not have a future for our children. These are the solutions in front of us. Draw from them to create a viable future. Over Christmas, my daughter, who now graduated from Oxford University and is studying agroecology, and I decided we wanted to prove the case to Henry Dimbleby, to, you know, Therese Villiers, to all these people in government, so that we can start to change the course of what we think about for having food security for our future. And we started to crank the figures and make all these models to try and say, can the UK feed itself agroecologically? Is it possible? Because Over in the Oxford Farming Conference, Syngenta, the different agri-tech companies, anybody involved in industrializing and intensifying our agriculture says, in order to sort out this planet, we've got to intensify further so that we can spare land for nature, so that we can have wild reserves and intensify our agriculture on small bits of land. So they're trying to claim this climate change budget that we are fighting as activists, as children wanting a better future for. We are fighting for our own survival. And they'll take that passion and that we've got to do that and change it into a way to keep pumping money into the agri-tech industry to intensify agriculture. If we don't capture it and say there is a better way, there's a way that we can share land with nature. We can create a way to provide all of the food we need while living in harmony with the earth and living a lifestyle that is a bit simpler but fulfilling and rewarding in a way that can keep sustaining ourselves from generation to generation. So we wanted to crank the figures on that, put it on a spreadsheet and see what it looks like. And when we started to put all the figures together, it looked like organic farming would take up a lot more land than trying to do it with conventional agriculture, but the difference wasn't that much. There's about 2 million hectares difference compared to 24 million hectares of land that we've got. But then when we started layering and looking at all the sort of things like combining, having our sheep under orchards where we produce our fruit, or using default livestock like the systems that, he was talking about in India, where you start using the waste products to feed your animals, or feeding waste to pigs and chickens, and all these sorts of things where we start combining land uses and layering them and thinking about how we really work in harmony with an ecosystem on so many different levels, as well as how we live. Then it worked. We had plenty of land for nature, and nature extended across our farms, and in fact, we become a part of nature. And we can live that way, and we can spread that knowledge from generation to generation. We've got a viable hope for our future, and that gives me so much hope. What you are doing by discovering these things, all the knowledge, everything you'll be talking about in all these workshops, and then putting into practice on the ground, sometimes it's going to be hard, trying to gain what we think is a viable livelihood while we're discovering and working out the ways to create all the food that we need on this planet in a way that doesn't impact everybody else and future generations. It will be hard for us in many ways to adjust to being able to do that and discover that. But viability isn't about just how much money you make. The root of the word viability is V, which means life. And if it is something that creates and sustains life for yourselves and your own way of being and for your children, then it is viable. And everything we're about is making sure that life continues, and life is powerful, and life is there for all of us to enjoy. Viva la vie!